me.
This is Based in Fact, a true crime podcast. Join host Lisa O'Brien as she examines America's most infamous true crime cases through the lens of the court, not the court of public opinion. No spin, no theories, no rumors, just facts. Here's Lisa O'Brien.
In episode 11, Kyle and I are talking about the May 5th, 1993 murders of Christopher Byers, Steve Branch, and Michael Moore in West Memphis, Arkansas. Their bodies were found bound and naked in a ditch in an area known to locals as Robin Hood Hills, a patch of woods bordering the boys' subdivision. On June 3rd, 1993, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley Jr. were arrested after Miskelley confessed to West Memphis detectives. The three were convicted after two separate trials in 1994. Their campaign in the court of public opinion started with Paradise Lost, the child murders in Robin Hood Hills, and continues today with press releases alleging that the state of Arkansas has an obligation to allow retesting of DNA evidence. Kyle and I will talk about the evidence against the three killers, their direct appeals of the state post-conviction claims and outcomes, the inconclusive DNA testing conducted between 2005 and 2011, and the Alford pleas, which were entered instead of the three killers presenting their allegedly exculpatory evidence at the new trial hearings that were scheduled to begin in December of 2011. And welcome back, Kyle. It's been a while.
Yeah, good evening. Good to be back.
We tried to record earlier today, and we had some technical difficulties caused by power outages in New Orleans. And so now hopefully we will be able to get this one in the books. So how has your time off been?
It's been good, been kind of crazy with the end of the school year. So getting all of that stuff wrapping up, it's been pretty crazy, but the summer brings its own craziness, but at least a little bit predictable craziness. But yeah, feels like one kid activity after another for the last month.
Yeah, didn't you have a child graduate?
I did, yes. Sending one graduating from high school, sending her off to college next year, and then one quote unquote graduating from middle school. So yeah, a lot of those kind of end of school activities, kind of the end of not only the school year, but the end of the kind of that phase in their life. So preparing one to leave hie school and one to enter.
Well, at least you didn't have two teenagers at the same time.
Yeah, that's very true.
So, because I know my parents had three of us because we were close in age, and they had three teenage girls at the same time.
Yes, God bless your dad.
Not a fun thing. So, all right, well, let's go ahead and we're going to talk about the West Memphis 3 case. Of course, as something we both remarked on earlier, was this is actually one of the first innocence fraud cases, and probably the first to use the internet to spread misinformation.
Yes, it is the OG misinformation case for sure. Yeah, so many people out there just immediately they hear this case like, oh, wrongly convicted, satanic panic, they're innocent, railroaded by incompetent cops. It's like all the talking points come out.
Because they listened to Metallica and wore black.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, but as anybody who really looks at the case and looks at the documents associated with the case, rather than having people tell them what the documents mean, you see that there's a lot more to the story than that. So, the story, of course, begins on May 5th, 1993. Steve, Chris, and Michael were riding bikes in their neighborhood in West Memphis, Arkansas. And that was during the afternoon and into the evening of May 5th. They were last seen at around 6 p.m., headed in the direction of Robin Hood Woods. The woods were comprised of 2 patches of woods bordering the neighborhood and separated or bisected by 10 Mile Bayou. And you and I have you've crossed that pipe.
Yeah, actually, we did a spring break trip in that area just this year. And so, yeah, actually a couple of months ago, walked across that pipe.
Yeah, it is an experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
To say the least. And for anybody who hasn't seen it for themselves, it's a rather large pipe. I think that the ditch in the woods was a kind of overflow. So when the bayou got too high, I guess water from the bayou would be channeled into the ditch on the other side, and there was a culvert and all that stuff. But it's a rather large pipe, and then on either side are 2 boards. A couple inches, they're like 2x4, but are they multiple boards end to end, or are they one single board?
No, I think there's, as I recall, there's one on each side. So yeah, it's kind of like a little, like 2, like it's a decent size, as I recall, not gigantic, but enough for, a person to walk, pretty comfortably on each side of the pipe bridge.
Yeah.
So it really is. It is. That's why they call it a pipe bridge, not just a pipe, because
But there are no handrails.
No, exactly. Yeah, no handrails.
If you lose your balance, you're going to go down, and then you're going to go into the bayou.
And get attacked by and murdered by a bunch of killer turtles.
Yeah, killer snapping turtles. Yeah. So of course and all the time when I was there, the ditch was still there, although they had built a passover. They had filled in part of it and made a culvert and built a passover so that people weren't climbing down and climbing back up, because at the time of the murders, basically you climb down and climb back up.
Right.
But when I was there, the level of water was not sufficient for any type of aquatic life at all. And I never saw a snapping turtle on the sides of the 10 Mile Bayou ditch or in the bayou in any way, shape, or form.
No, this is the same thing. And yeah, exactly. When I was there, I didn't see any turtles either. I think the biggest thing for folks that, think about it, that, they have bulldozed. I don't know. I think it's been a few years ago, but the woods are gone today. So basically you can actually see from the interstate actually, into the neighborhood, which you would not have been able to do in 1993.
I believe that was done probably sometime, I want to say around 2005, 2006. If I recall. That
sounds right. It seems like it has been quite a while ago.
Yeah, and the owner was worried about liability with people going back there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So he decided, and I think they filled in the ditch and everything, so there's nothing.
Yeah, the ditch where the boys were found. Yeah, that's right. I think it has been completely filled in. So it almost looks like it's not exactly a pasture, but more like a pasture now than it did.
Yeah. Because there was a farm field. I think it had grown wheat at one time as well. But there was a farm field, and then there were the woods, and they weren't real wide. They weren't real big. So, and something else that we talked about earlier, the woods that were on the opposite side of the bayou in the neighborhood were very thick and very overgrown. And so you couldn't have gone into those woods if you wanted to. So that was, there was a lot of discussion about the kids weren't going into the woods on the other side of 10 Mile Bayou. They were going on the ones right there in the neighborhood. But no, anybody who lived down there knew those woods were overgrown and very thick, and you could barely even walk. You certainly wouldn't have bike trails and be able to ride your bike.
Right.
So, and something else that you remarked on, this was at a time when kids were not as carefully watched as they are today.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, back then, kids would, as I think we both of our experiences growing up, yeah, kids would go out. Sometimes they'd be pushed out of the house. They get out of here, go do something, go play. And yeah, they'd ride their bikes, they'd run around, they just make fun out of, whatever they could figure out, make up a game, play in the woods. And yeah, when the street lamps came on, it was time to go home. And so
yeah,
it was a much different time. People, parents weren't as paranoid. Kids just played outside and did stuff, which becomes germane because, again, when people talk about, why did it take so long for the parents to react? It's no great conspiracy, but it was kind of normal.
Yeah. And well, of course, they make a big deal. It depends on what they're trying to prove. If they're trying to prove that Mark Byers is guilty, then they say, oh, well, him reporting Chris missing at 8:10 is, proof that he killed him because he's the only one who knows something bad happened at 8:10.
Right.
Or I think recently Rob Ruff was talking to one of the Clementes, and they were saying how Terry Hobbs waiting until 9 p.m. to report Steve missing is somehow proves he killed him.
It's crazy.
And it's interesting when you look at statements that were made at the time. Mark Byers did not put Chris with Michael and Steve when he initially reported Chris missing. It was Dana Moore who actually said, no, Chris, Michael, and Steve were together.
All together.
And I don't think there's anything from Terry putting all three together, which you'd think he would have known if he'd killed them.
Right.
But, so yeah, that's that they didn't call the police at 5 o'clock when they were supposed to be home. They didn't call them until 7 or 8 when they really should have been home, was because in those days, and this is one of the cases that kind of changed how parents monitor their kids outside because of this happening in their own neighborhood, that it got a little bit more they gave it a little bit more scrutiny.
Yeah, everybody became afraid that, there was a kidnapper on every corner.
And I think it had a ripple effect across the country. This case and a few other child abduction cases had kind of that ripple effect where parents thought, okay, you can't let your kids just go out and run around the neighborhood anymore because something bad can happen. So, again, the boys were reported missing. Chris and Mike were reported at 8:10 p.m. and then Steve was reported at 9. Prior to that, the parents had all separately looked for their child. But then once the boys were reported missing, there were more neighbors and more friends of siblings and things like that became involved, and a more concentrated search began. But for some reason, the West Memphis Police Department did not join that search officially. And that night, the Crittenden County Search and Rescue people were having a meeting, so they weren't available. And I know Pam Hicks has said, she's upset that West Memphis PD didn't get involved that night, as she has every right to be. And Mark Byers tried to get search and rescue to come out, but they were in their meeting and they weren't available. The following morning on the 6th, West Memphis Police and several county agencies did join the search and provided reinforcements. At around 1 p.m., a juvenile probation officer observed a shoe floating in a ditch in the woods across 10 Mile Bayou. At 1:45 p.m., Sergeant Mike Allen, who was a West Memphis PD detective, fell into the ditch while trying to retrieve the shoe, and in doing so, dislodged Michael Moore's body, which had been in the ditch bottom. Brian Ridge, another West Memphis detective, searched the ditch bottom on his hands and knees, and at 2:59, he located the bodies of Chris and Steve. Steve was found 27 feet south of Michael. Chris was found 32 feet south of Michael and 5 feet from Steve. All three boys were naked and bound wrist to ankle by their own shoelaces. Substantially all of their clothing was also found in the ditch near Michael's body. Steve and Michael's bikes were found in 10 Mile Bayou directly under the pipe bridge crossing the bayou. And it was Michael's bike on one side and Steve's bike on the other. Like they had just been rolled out into the middle of the bayou and dumped from each side. And I want to remark on something else too. Even though the water wasn't, it was about 2 to 2.5 feet deep in the ditch, you could not visualize the bodies from above the water. It was only when, like I said, when Mike Allen dislodged Michael, when he essentially fell onto the area where Michael was, and Brian Ridge had to search on his hands and knees on the ditch bottom till he found Chris and Steve.
I can't imagine. Hearing it, no matter how many times you hear it, just kind of processing it, having to discover that, I can't imagine what an impact that would have on those policemen. I mean, you're going to see some crazy stuff as a cop, but I don't think anything prepares you for seeing that.
When Brian Ridge testified at a post-conviction hearing for Echols in about 1999, and he actually lost composure while he testified about that. And then later, he would not talk about it to anyone. He left police work for a while, but then ended up coming back. And shortly before I moved to West Memphis, or moved to Marion in Arkansas, Brian Ridge actually saved another officer's life. The officer was in the parking lot, end of his shift, getting his equipment out of the car, and somehow he triggered the shotgun in his car and inflicted very serious wounds on himself. And if Brian Ridge hadn't gotten to him and rendered first aid, he probably would not have survived. So that was a really huge accomplishment for Brian Ridge to be that hands-on in saving someone else's life.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So during the initial investigation, the West Memphis PD followed up on various leads, which included looking at local teenagers who were known to dabble in the occult. In an initial interview on May 10th, 1993, Damien Echols gave answers to various questions that made him a suspect, but the West Memphis PD had insufficient evidence to arrest him at that time. Now, one of the reasons they looked at Damien Echols as being involved in the occult is because that's what he told the juvenile officers every time they talked to him. He made statements like, I'm in a cult. I'm in a cult that's about to graduate to human sacrifice. He told him why, and he says, I was just messing with him. Well, guess what, sweetie? You messed with him and it bit you on the ass, didn't it? Because they took you seriously. You may have been joking, but they took you seriously.
Well, and that's the thing is people, there's this weird disinformation out there that these were the only 3 guys in the entire state of Arkansas that listened to heavy metal and wore Metallica t-shirts. When in reality, there were lots of kids in the early 90s that listened to Metallica and wore black t-shirts and had long hair. But there weren't a lot that, talked, that were known, or at least, had reportedly, killed a dog, killed other animals, talked about being, wanting to murder children. I mean, Damien Echols was not just the run-of-the-mill Metallica fan. He was a lunatic who talked about being a lunatic and seemed to get off on making other people thinking he was a lunatic.
Right. Yeah, he cultivated that, and he cultivated the he's the one that told people about people supposedly seeing him in 2 places at one time. That came from him. And one of the things that, is always a big trigger for me, and basically an indicator for me that the person who was convicted is guilty, is that everybody's lying except that person and the people advocating for that person. They're the only ones telling the truth.
Exactly. Yes. Well, and I think this is a good time to think about too. Oh, he wasn't really into all this. He was just kidding. Well, he has had about as much luck as OJ finding the real killers, which I believe they said they were going to do. But yet he spent all his time pretending to be, a magician and a magical, mystery magician. I think he's even written a couple of books about it, probably just to raise money through GoFundMe. But, it's not like he's all of a sudden become an accountant, I mean, he's definitely continued on this path of, whatever occult kind of worship, he's definitely who he is.
The Halloween costume he chose for 2011 was a vampire.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think his favorite author is Aleister Crowley.
Yeah. And and he got caught lying on the stand about not knowing anything about Aleister Crowley. And yet Aleister Crowley, his son, and Jason Baldwin are the 2 names, are the names he writes in code on his little piece of paper in his cell. And it's so funny that I actually argued with someone that they illegally, their allegation was his cell was illegally searched. I'm like, sweetie, when you're in jail, you have no expectation of privacy. They don't have to have a search warrant. They don't have to have probable cause. They could say, I don't like your face, and toss your cell. And if they find contraband, that's on you. But on June 3rd, 1993, West Memphis police brought Jessie Misskelley Jr. in for questioning because he was a known associate of Echols. After 4 hours, Misskelley confessed to participating in the murders and named Echols and Jason Baldwin as his accomplices. And now it's kind of interesting too, because that's another thing that is misrepresented. Echols and Baldwin pretend that they didn't even know Misskelley that well. And he certainly wasn't a friend and never hung out with them. But when you look at statements from other people and contemporaneous statements at the time of the murders and during the investigation, Baldwin and Misskelley in grade school were best of friends. And when Baldwin became friends with Echols, they kind of had Misskelley around. And I think they had Misskelley around because he was pliable and he was somebody that they could get to do their bidding.
Exactly.
So, but yeah, and a lot of people, a lot of witnesses, a lot of people aligned with Echols and Baldwin all, put Misskelley with them as a person that hung around with them. So
exactly. Well, aren't they on video too? Aren't they? Isn't there somebody that did a video at the
pool hall or skating rink? Yeah.
This is not a gigantic city, right? Everybody pretty much knows everybody.
And they all lived in Marion.
Right.
And I think at one time Baldwin lived in the trailer park where Jessie Misskelley's father lived.
I think
And
that's
then they
exactly.
moved to Lakeshore. Echols lived in West Memphis, but he had lived in Lakeshore and he was staying in Lakeshore with Dominique during that time. So, and the two trailer parks, Lakeshore's on one side of the I-40, or I think it's I-55. Yeah, is on one side of I-55 going toward Marion from West Memphis, and Miskelley's is on the other side.
Right.
You know, have you ever been to those trailer parks?
I have not. No, I wanted to, but I ran out of time.
Your next trip, you should check out the two trailer parks. So yeah, that's so they're right across the street, and they all went to the same school because they all went to the Marion High School. So, well, Miskelley dropped out in like 9th grade. And Echols dropped out, I think, when he was in 9th grade, because he was a little bit older than they were. So on the 3rd, arrest warrants were issued for Miskelley, Echols, and Baldwin, and search warrants were also issued for their trailers, as well as the trailer of Dominique Tears, who was Echols' pregnant girlfriend. They were indicted on 3 counts each of capital murder. Echols was represented by Val Price and Scott Davidson. Baldwin was represented by Paul Ford and George Robin Wadley. And Miskelley was represented by Dan Stidham and Greg Crow. And I think the public defender's office had a conflict for some reason, perhaps because they had represented Mark Byers, or because they were representing Echols because he was a death penalty, and so they couldn't represent Baldwin and Miskelley. But I've never really untangled that with the actual pleadings. This is just my memory of what I've read.
Right.
So Miskelley, their trials were moved fairly early from Crittenden County, where the murders occurred. Miskelley's was moved first because he had given a confession that was going to be used against him, so he could not be tried with Echols and Baldwin. And his case was moved from Crittenden to Corning, which is in Clay County. And in February 1994, Miskelley was convicted of 1 count of first-degree murder for Michael's death and 2 counts of second-degree murder for Stevie and Chris. And the reason he was convicted of first degree with Michael is because in his statement to West Memphis police, he says, Michael ran away and I chased him down and brought him back. So, but for Miskelley's action, Michael might have been able to get away. And Michael might not have been killed. He was sentenced to life on the first-degree murder charge and 2 20-year terms on the second-degree murder counts. His conviction and sentence were affirmed on direct appeal and became final in 1996. Now, after he was convicted, he did want to talk to the prosecutors, and he did express a desire to testify against Echols and Baldwin, who were due to go to trial within a few weeks. Yeah. There was a second statement taken with his attorney, Dan Stidham, there begging him not to talk, not to, give this statement. And I think, I to this day do not understand why Dan Stidham would want to help Echols and Baldwin by keeping Miskelley off the stand.
Yeah.
And not help Miskelley get a reduction in his prison sentence. If he had testified, they were willing to knock off the life sentence.
That's always been odd to me as well. It's like, why wouldn't they say, we'll give you 25 years or 40 years, whatever it was.
I I think what the agreement was is that they would recommend that the first degree, that the life sentence be vacated, and that he only be sentenced to the 2 20-year terms, which 40 years he would have served 25
It seems right.
in, in Arkansas DOC, and then he would have been eligible for parole. With the life term, he would never be eligible for parole because you had to serve, I think, 80% or 70 to 80% of your sentence.
Yeah.
And with a life sentence, there's no 70 or 80%.
Well, I mean, and the funny part too is it's kind of one of those things that, these claims, they make sense in isolation, but they don't make sense together, which is like they talk about, oh, well, Jessie Misskelley, he's, basically, mentally handicapped, he can barely function in society, but he can totally remember this plan that the police have told him, and he can totally remember how to make up this confession. It just doesn't make any sense, right? It's like, what's more likely? You can remember what you actually experience, and in all those details just about chasing Michael and Michael being found further away. Like, I mean, there's so many of those details
and
that he would not have known, but yet they believe he can just totally remember that. I mean, he can totally, the police can coach him, and now like, oh yeah, I can totally perfectly recall that.
And that's a detail, chasing Michael down, Michael running away. That's something they didn't know.
No,
that's something West Memphis PD didn't know. And they've given, and there's this this allegation that the tape was turned on and off. No, it was not turned on and off. It was turned on. He gave his first confession. It was turned off. Some time passed, and then Gary Gitchell came back and the tape was turned on again, and he gave a follow-up statement, and then the tape was turned off. It wasn't, Bob Ruff, I think, portrays it as though they ask him a question, then they turn the tape off, tell him the answer, and then turn it back on for him to give the answer. And he had this weird thing about, well, you can hear they're tapping. So that means they're pointing at a picture and telling him which kid is which. Or you hear this or you hear that, or, and it's like, how can you say there are visual clues when there's no videotape?
Yeah.
That's speculating.
I get tired of giving him publicity, but let's just remember the podcaster you mentioned previously, when he was a fire chief of a town of like 300 people were literally stealing money from his own department and he didn't notice. So I don't have a lot of confidence in him being able to investigate where his own butthole is. Pardon my language, but I mean,
oh boy,
he's not exactly president of the local Mensa chapter.
The Twitterverse is gonna love that one. I usually get quoted on Twitter, but I bet you are going to get quoted on Twitter now. So so he ended up he got a raw deal. And really, when he was saying ineffective assistance of counsel, Dan Stidham said, yep, I was ineffective because I decided instead of helping my own client, I would help Echols and Baldwin by keeping my client off the stand. And of course, Dan Stidham gives that whole, well, I didn't want him committing perjury. It's not up to you to decide whether or not he committed perjury.
Exactly.
You think it's perjury, but as I understand it, he has confessed to you with his hand on a Bible. And the DAs were not anywhere around. So, you don't want to believe it, but that's you. That's on you. Too bad, so sad, sucks to be you, because he was involved in this. Nobody gives a false confession 10 times.
No.
And substantially the same false confession in which they identify the same individuals. And Miskelley may not be the brightest bulb in the Christmas tree string, but he's smart enough to try to get one over on the cops.
Well, that's exactly right. Because I mean, I think he said, right, when he gave his first confession, he was trying to kind of fudge on the times,
Because he
so
had an
he's
alibi.
obviously more clever than the podcaster fired fireman you mentioned, because at least he was clever enough to try to, fudge a little bit to say, hey, I'm going to say enough to where they'll let me go home,
Yeah.
but not enough for me to get in trouble. Maybe they'll go get the other two guys.
Yeah. And, people don't understand too that, Miskelley was not a scholar. He has the communication skills of a turnip. He's more articulate at hitting things and people than he is speaking. He can't use his words, so he uses his fists.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was his reputation around town. And that's probably another reason that Echols and Baldwin kept him around. Because then they could get him in trouble.
Right.
And people,
he was the guy that they get convinced to go do something stupid,
Mhm.
and then they could all laugh while he went and did it. We all know
Yeah.
people like that.
Yeah. And another thing that, people don't remember is that in March of 1993, he attacked a girl with a brick for telling people that she didn't sleep with him, because he was going around saying he had sex with her. And she said, I didn't sleep with Jessie Misskelley. No freaking way. I wouldn't touch him with somebody else's hand. But he attacked her with a brick. Then there was apparently he attacked a 5-year-old kid like the year before. And then of course there's Echols, year before the murders, he's got multiple admissions into psychiatric hospitals, twice in Arkansas and once in Oregon. And those were resulting from, the one in Oregon resulted from threats made to his father and his family and their fear of him. So, they were not well adjusted. And I think
No.
Baldwin's the one that's kind of kept his dirty laundry quiet, or it's been kept quiet. Although anybody who talks to his mother knows she's bat crap crazy.
Yeah.
And, he's a kid who has found his mother after unsuccessful suicide attempts on at least 2 occasions, because she was not a happy woman.
No.
So, but yeah, she was, she's not playing with a full deck. She's a taco short of a combo. So, yeah, I don't mean that to be, well, it is insensitive, but it's the only way to describe it. Echols and Baldwin were tried together. Their trial had been moved from Crittenden to Jonesboro in Craighead County, Arkansas. And that's another bit of myth that has been out there and you still see occasionally today, is that they were tried in West Memphis. And that is absolutely false. And anyone who thinks they were tried in West Memphis knows absolutely nothing about the case. Including Echols' current attorneys who are trying to get him DNA testing by filing in the wrong county. In March of 1994, Echols was convicted of 3 counts of capital murder and sentenced to death. Baldwin was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Their convictions and sentences were also affirmed on direct appeal and became final in 1997. And then in post-conviction, Echols' Rule 37 claims, which were filed around 1998, were denied by the trial court, and that claim was affirmed by the Arkansas Supreme Court. Echols filed some writ of error claims. One, that he wasn't competent to stand trial at the time of his trial, but that was rejected by the Arkansas Supreme Court because it was based on records and observations made of him during the pretrial period and during the trial. And then suddenly somebody saying, oh, wait, he wasn't competent. And there was also a competency determination after his conviction because he tried to drop all appeals and then changed his mind. A lot like his suicide attempts. You know, he would do something and then he would say, I'm going to kill myself. So somebody would stop it.
Right.
When he was in jail, he, after the arrest for these murders, he hoarded some of his medication. He took it all at once. He immediately called the guard and said, I just took all my medication. I'm going to kill myself. And have you ever seen the suicide note on the Marlboro cigarette box?
No, I have not.
Oh, okay. If I can find it, I'll find it and email it to you. Echols filed a federal writ of habeas corpus in federal court, but that ended up being stayed because he filed a motion for new trial based on the results of DNA testing, and the federal case could not proceed until all those state actions had been concluded. And of course, they concluded with the Alford plea in 2011. Baldwin and Misskelley filed Rule 37 claims. I think those claims were still pending. There had been hearings, but I don't know that they had ever been decided by Judge Burnett. And the motions for new trial, they filed motions for new trial at the same time Echols did, or shortly after Echols. And so those were all pending at the time of the Alford pleas. So, and you know, the idea that all this was part of some grand conspiracy is the other thing. And that's every case that I've talked about and researched, is that direct appeal, oh my gosh, it's part of the conspiracy. Even though all these things were done wrong at trial, even though they didn't get fair trials, the direct appeal, the fix was in. Like, no, they didn't win in direct appeal because they didn't prove that they didn't get a fair trial. He didn't win at Rule 37 because he didn't prove ineffective assistance of counsel or whatever other claims he was making. And I'll have to look and see if I have any notes from the appellate and post-conviction pre-DNA. Because this is just a really quick summary I did to talk about the DNA. So, and go ahead.
Well, the crazy the massive police conspiracies are always funny because, you think about, I think maybe the most famous of the innocence fraud cases is the Stephen Avery case. And it's like, you know what? The police did this mass conspiracy. They murdered this woman, framed Stephen Avery so he wouldn't win his civil judgment against the police.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, actually, no, again, back to Occam's razor, the cops would have just killed him. Like, why would they kill an innocent woman and set up this mass conspiracy to keep him from winning his judgment? If they were that sophisticated, they would have just killed him, and they would have never solved the crime. It's kind of like the same thing. If they had it out for Damien Echols, they could have done something else besides kill 3 little boys and blame it on him, and all this crazy conspiracy stuff. It's just way too complicated by a mile.
And I think in Stephen Avery's case, if they were going to do that, Teresa Hallback's full body would be in his trailer under his
Exactly.
bed with her DNA all over the place, because
they don't do
that's
a very
another
good job
thing.
of framing people.
Yeah, that's another thing in this case, because people say that they framed Echols, Baldwin, and Miskelley, but if they were going to frame him, I'm sure they would have done more than inconclusive fibers and hairs.
Exactly.
That was the only physical evidence that was ever admitted against them.
Yeah.
You know, they would have had victims' blood on their clothing, since they couldn't put Echols and Baldwin's blood, or they would have put it on the victim's clothing. You know, I mean, so, and I haven't in all my years, even I have yet to see an actual true frame. Maybe because it doesn't actually get this far. Maybe
Right.
it's attempted, but it doesn't make it.
Yeah, I think they're only in movies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and as everybody knows, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, the attempts to DNA test began in 2002. But contrary to what the propaganda would have us all believe, they really don't want to test everything. They don't want to test Echols' necklace, and they don't want to test Miskelley's shirt, because they don't want to risk that the victim's blood is going to be found on those two items, because that there would end their claims of actual innocence. They want to test the ligatures. They want to test, and it's not really they're not really risking all that much testing evidence that was all submerged under the water for 18 hours, along with the bodies. And the results of the DNA testing that was done kind of confirms that, because most of the profiles that were recovered from evidence belonged to the victims. And they had very few items that were, that were full profiles that did not belong to the victims. And then they had a few hairs. Again, the majority of the hairs were from the victims. And with the exception of two that didn't exclude Hobbs or his friend David Jacoby. So all those years and all that testing and all that money, and really the results were inconclusive. And they did not identify another perpetrator with nuclear DNA. And so, of course, they have misrepresented the mitochondrial DNA as conclusive when it is not. Because mitochondrial DNA is passed unchanged from mother to child. So that hair that doesn't exclude Terry Hobbs also doesn't exclude his mother, his grandmother, his maternal aunts and uncles, his siblings, his sister's kids, however many sisters he has.
Yeah.
All their children are going to have the same identical mitochondrial DNA. That's just like my Uncle Gary, my sisters, my two sisters, my nephew. We all have identical mitochondrial DNA.
Well, and I think, right, didn't it match like 98,000 people in a kind of broader region,
Well, I'm not gonna speak to the statistics, because I'm really not good at the statistics. But there's another problem with the mitochondrial DNA results. The hair that was actually on the ligature differed at one nucleotide from Hobbs's mitochondrial DNA. So really, in the universe, it matches, it can exclude Hobbs, but for that one nucleotide difference.
Hmm.
But it also can't exclude anybody who has the identical mitochondrial DNA sequence as the actual evidence hair. So it's kind of two universes,
Right.
or two
Well,
sets that
but
aren't excluded.
Well, I mean, I would say regardless, you would expect, I mean, a family member's hair being on a kid isn't that crazy.
Right.
You know, it's not like,
Right.
if somebody, if Damien Echols' hair was found, that would be unusual, but not a family member. I mean, they live in the house, they're going to, drop hairs, they're going to pick it up. I mean,
And
to me, that's not that interesting.
they make a lot of the fact that it was on the ligature binding Michael, but we don't know whose shoelace, who that ligature belonged
Absolutely.
to. It
That
might have been
the
Michael, and it might have been Chris, but it also might have been Steve. And if it's Terry's hair on Steve's lace, it loses any evidentiary significance.
right. Well, and I mean, I admit I'm totally speculating, but I
Yeah.
mean, the hair could have been brushed from Stevie's body to the killer's body and then
Mhm.
fallen off while they're tying ligature. I mean,
Yeah.
that is not an insane scenario.
Right. The theory with the fibers was that these were fibers in the clothing environment that were picked up by Echols and left on the victim's clothing, and picked up by Baldwin and left on the victim's clothing, even though the clothing that was consistent with those fibers did not belong to either Echols or Baldwin.
Right.
And so it's kind of the same thing. Yeah. And then the hair on the tree stump, it's the same issue with the nucleotide, one nucleotide difference.
Yes.
So basically two sets. There's the people with the identical mitochondrial DNA that couldn't be excluded, and people with David Jacoby's DNA, mitochondrial DNA, that can't be excluded. But it's never been conclusive. Yet they will, and I have seen places where Echols has done this. He has said they found the stepfather's hair. No, they didn't find his hair. They found a hair that doesn't exclude him as a donor. Echols' own expert at the press conference said, well, we couldn't use this to accuse Terry Hobbs. And the hair with David Jacoby was found on a tree stump at the crime scene. And it was found on June 3rd because the fiber and hair examiner came to West Memphis to conduct the searches and went to the crime scene and found the hair while she was searching the crime scene.
And didn't the failed fireman also make a blanket proclamation that there's no way Jacoby could be involved, that he's met him and he has deemed him trustworthy or something like that, as I recall?
Yeah, I really, yeah, he did. And, but he's just trying to milk as much money from this as he can. He had his podcast, which had to stop suddenly because of some earth-shattering legal development that never happened.
Yeah, he had new evidence, right? He was going to solve the case in the next 6 months.
And then he had his Oxygen show. And I think that's why the podcast had to stop, because Oxygen said, we're not going to pay you to make a documentary for, when you're going to reveal it on your podcast. And I watched the documentary and it didn't reveal shit about anything. It was just a bunch of self-serving bullshit about the DNA testing. And again, this is another place where Bob Ruff is lying to you people, and you don't realize it. The state does not have an obligation to conduct DNA testing. The state does not have an obligation to allow Echols to conduct DNA testing. And the state sure as shit never had an obligation to allow Bob Ruff to conduct DNA testing. The future investigation that was supposedly promised to the killers with the Alford pleas by the prosecutor was never reduced to writing. Nothing in the Alford plea document says, but they can continue investigating, and we'll look at anything they give us and take it seriously, and we'll do any testing they want to do in the future. Nothing says that. And the most Ellington ever said is he's willing to look at whatever they bring him. And what did they bring him in 2013? And it wasn't even them. It was Mark Byers and Pam Hicks who brought him Billy Ray Stewart and Benny Guy, two rapists who were in Arkansas DOC with Baldwin, who had a fantasy story about confessions made to them by L.G. Hollingsworth and Buddy Lucas. The problem for them is that Buddy Lucas was still alive. And Ken Swindle actually had Buddy Lucas appear at the hearing, but did not put him on the stand and ask him about the confession that he allegedly made to Benny Guy. And this is the other thing, is somehow Benny Guy and Billy Ray Stewart both knew Lucas and L.G. Hollingsworth. And independently, these two made statements to each of them. And their statements were basically that Hobbs and Jacoby were driving around the trailer park looking for weed. They picked up Hollingsworth and Lucas. They went to the woods. Jacoby and Hobbs were having sex with each other. The boys came in and Hobbs and Jacoby killed them. And I think both the victims in Benny Guy's, I think Benny Guy's case, the victim was underage. In Billy Ray Stewart's case, if she was of age, she was mentally unable to give consent. So they were two rapists. And Benny Guy, I think Ken Swindle was able to get him out of Arkansas DOC, but he also had a conviction in Texas for a similar rape. And so he went from Arkansas to Texas and went into the prison system in Texas. And interestingly enough, he and Billy Ray Stewart have tried to exonerate each other by giving each other affidavits that say, I committed the crime that he was convicted for. He didn't do it. He's innocent. So I don't think either one of these men is trustworthy, and therefore what they said is not reliable, not credible, and not a basis for saying Echols, Baldwin, and Miskelley are absolutely actually innocent. But that's, you're speechless.
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly the innocence, fraud, conspiracies. It's actually, I was like, while you were talking, I'm trying to work it out in my head. I'm like, I don't even understand.
Yeah. And it's been long enough and nothing ever came of it, but I actually helped David Jacoby submit a complaint against Ken Swindle to the Arkansas bar, because what had happened to David Jacoby was he was served by a process server, and it wasn't, I think there were flaws in the service, but it was too late for him to go that route and challenge it. But he was served by like a private investigator. He went to this hearing to be called a murderer in front of TV cameras. And it had upset him greatly. So he and I worked on and helped him with a a letter to the Arkansas State Bar, lodging a complaint against Swindle, and unfortunately, nothing was ever done. The bar did not take action or did not find it to be sufficient to act upon, which is really a shame because we included the affidavits, which were works of pure fiction. And, the circumstances of him being subpoenaed and all that.
Well, and that's the stuff. I mean, that's what's so weird about, these people that are so concerned about wrongful convictions and the whole innocence fraud movement. It's so hypocritical that they just lose their mind about people that have been convicted by multiple juries multiple times, but yet they have no problem just throwing out unsubstantial accusations about anybody. They have no problem completely,
and
committing slander or libel against innocent people just because.
And you often see them using the same tactics that they accuse the police and prosecutors of using against their targets.
Yeah, of course. Yep.
And they see it as justified because that person is the real killer. So,
yeah, which by their logic, then, the police would be justified doing anything to get somebody convicted if they're quote unquote the real killer. I mean, it's just the ultimate hypocrisy.
Yeah.
That's part of what frustrates me.
Yeah. So, all right. So let's skip forward to 2011. They've done all the DNA testing. They've asked for additional testing. They've gotten it. They have been claiming to have results, but they don't ever release those results, or they only release them partially. In 2011, on July 25th, Echols files a supplemental DNA status report in which he reports that 12 new hairs had been tested. He reported 3 hairs incapable of testing, 8 hairs yielding mitochondrial DNA profile consistent with Chris, and 1 yielding a profile that was not consistent with any of the victims and excluded Echols, Baldwin, and Miskelley, and I presume also excluded Hobbs. But they don't say that. So then I'm sure people like Ruff will say, oh, well, look, there's another hair. Because it doesn't say it excludes him. But they don't release the reports. This is a summary in a status report to the Arkansas Supreme Court, which got a little testy in 2004 or 2003 because there was this effort to get DNA testing that was delaying one of Echols' appeals, and it was never done. And he just kept asking for extensions of time so that this testing can be done, and extensions of time so the testing can be done. So the Supreme Court finally said, okay, look, you need to tell us what's going on with this DNA testing. So he had to send these status reports in, and then that started, I think, in like 2005 or 2006. And a lot of the reports are available on Callahan. They did change the domain name. And so sometimes if you don't find a document, if you get a broken link with the some of the documents, if you conform the name to the prior site, you'll find it, because they haven't migrated everything over to the new domain.
Okay. What's the new domain name?
Hang on a second. Let me tell you. Okay. Callahan.mysite.com. And that's CALLAHAN.mysite, MYSITE.com.
Yeah, hopefully some of the folks listening who are interested will actually go read some of the original documents and the original, primary
Yeah.
sources, and not just listen to the Johnny Depps of the world tell them that these guys are innocent.
Right, exactly. So yeah, that is, and like I said, sometimes you'll some of the documents you will encounter broken links. It either is it either, and I've had this happen both ways. It's either trying to go back to the old domain, or they haven't transferred everything to the new domain. So if you see callahan.ak.com, put in my site and you'll find it'll go to the document or it'll go to the page. If it's Callahan my site and it's a broken link, put in Callahan 8K, because those documents are still out there. And that is, and I would suggest go look at the pleadings that are available, because among multiple people contributed their time and efforts and money to getting these documents from the West Memphis PD, from the crime lab, from the courts. And it really is worth reading. You can go read the DNA status reports and see that the DNA testing was never conclusive or even exculpatory. Not having DNA from Echols, Baldwin, and Misskelley is not in and of itself exculpatory. Nor is finding Terry Hobbs' DNA or John Byers' DNA or even Todd Moore's DNA exculpatory. That is a myth that is used often in innocence fraud cases. And ironically, I mean, we have the Rodney Reed case where his DNA is all over the place, but he's supposedly actually innocent.
Right, exactly.
So
yeah, there's always there's an explanation for everything except the most obvious.
Yeah. You use Occam's razor a lot, and this is another one of those cases where Occam's razor is, the simplest answer is
right,
the right one.
Well, and mind you, it's been 29 years later, and there hasn't been a single credible evidence that points to anybody else.
Yeah.
You would think after all these, no one's talked, no one said anything, there's not been a deathbed confession. I mean, and again, you think about it, okay, these three guys are either the killers or they're the three unluckiest people in the world, because all of these coincidences perfectly line up to point to that.
Yeah. And I had summarized all those coincidences at one time. And it's had to change a couple times over the years, because some things that I relied on were later not as reliable as I thought they were at the time of the original trial. But again, if you look at it through the lens of the original trial and what the jury knew, these are all the coincidences.
Right.
So yeah, but it's still, I think I came up with like 40 coincidences for them to be, they're actually innocent. And the biggest one is every time Miskelley has confessed, the only people he's ever named have been Echols and Baldwin.
Exactly. When you're not even mentioning things like that, I don't think get a lot of publicity, or like the fibers that match the robe. I think Baldwin's mom's robe, the purple wax, some of these things that, may not even, largely introduced as evidence, but still it's like, okay, wait a minute, how could all these coincidences work out this way?
And the fibers were a coincidence. They weren't conclusive. They were never held out to be conclusive.
Exactly. Yeah, right.
But they weren't conclusive. But then again, the fibers from the original trial are the same as the hairs from their claims of innocence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no one's looking at those fibers and saying this conclusively means that they're guilty. It's just, if you're going to use the same logic for the Terry Hobbs hair, then you have to use the same logic for these fibers. And again, it just shows you all these 40 things that are all worked out coincidentally to point to them.
And I just saw on Facebook, I saw somebody make the allegation that the state made them enter the Alford pleas because it was afraid of the liability that it had for their wrongful convictions. So 10 years, 11 years down the line, we still have people who think that the state made them take Alford pleas that they didn't want to take. This is not true. This is false. Anybody who makes you think the state forced them to take the Alford pleas, they are lying to you.
No,
They're
absolutely.
painting it in the light that makes the three killers look innocent and look like the state did something wrong. And that's another problem that, my former co-host and my former blog talk colleagues have, is that they want to presume the worst of the state and they want to focus on the state having done wrong, but they don't want to look at the big picture or the whole picture, which includes what the killers did. The state didn't make them take the Alford pleas. It said, if you want out of prison, you'll take the Alford plea that your attorney said you would take. And it wasn't the state that got Baldwin to take the Alford plea. It was Lori Davis, who made him feel bad because Echols was supposedly dying in prison, or Echols was going to be executed, which was another lie because it was 6 years after the Alford pleas before Arkansas started executing people again.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I mean, usually, executions, if a state executes somebody within, 30 years is pretty, it is pretty aggressive.
Right.
They wait and wait and wait and wait.
Correct.
It's not like they're executed, 5 years after the murders. And you've seen Damien Echols when he got out of prison. He looks pretty healthy.
Yeah, he went.
He's certainly enjoying the lot of that all-you-can-eat prison food buffet. He does not look like he is dying.
And well, he went from the Jonesboro hearing. They drove to Memphis, and he was on the rooftop partying at one of the, I think, the Madison Hotel until the wee hours of the morning.
And he also claimed, right, that his inmate next door broke into his cell, chiseled through the brick walls, came in, raped him, then, sealed, left and sealed it back perfectly. The guy,
that was Mark Gardner.
Yeah.
And that was actually what happened. Was he claimed that Mark Gardner was coming in his cell through that hole. And then when it was determined that Mark Gardner would not have fit through that hole, that Echols had to have been crawling through the hole, then he said Gardner was forcing him to crawl through the hole. I would have been on the other side like, yeah, what are you going to do about it, asshole? Nobody's going to make me crawl through a hole in a cinder block wall.
Well, and that's always kind of been one of those it's definitely the theory, much like kind of all the crazy Terry Hobbs stuff that, Jason and Damien were more than friends, and maybe even the boys came across them enjoying their friendship.
Yeah. I use this. I've used it with some people, and I think Damien Echols is probably one of them. I would not believe Damien Echols if his tongue came notarized, because he lies. He's a liar. He tells the story. First, Mark Gardner's coming in his cell and raping him. Then Mark Gardner's making him climb through a hole to rape him. And then he and Mark Gardner cooked up these allegations because there was all kinds of corruption at the prison and they were trying to expose it. He's a dog ate my homework liar.
Exactly.
Because half the time his lies don't even make any sense. He just says whatever comes to mind to manipulate and get his way. So the Alford plea came about, and there's an article in Northwest Arkansas Online, the nwaonline.com, and that is a pro-killer source. So it's not like I'm quoting from Fox News here. But Echols' attorneys are quoted as saying the defense had long pondered whether it should pitch a deal that would set their clients free immediately, said Stephen Braga, a Washington, D.C. defense attorney for Echols. The possibility of such a deal first took shape August 3rd in Little Rock when Patrick Benka, another defense attorney representing Echols, had lunch with an old friend from law school, Arkansas Attorney General Dustin McDaniel. And Benka and McDaniel are now law partners. Benka asked McDaniel if he thought that the state might be amenable to a plea agreement, Braga said, and McDaniel suggested defense attorneys meet with the prosecution, which McDaniel then arranged. At first, prosecutors wanted a guilty plea in exchange for the men's release. Braga told them no deal. The two sides discussed a no contest plea in which a defendant neither admits nor disputes a charge. Braga then proposed an Alford plea, which allows the defendant to plead guilty while still proclaiming his innocence in court. It stems from a 1970 U.S. Supreme Court case in which justices ruled that no constitutional barriers prevent a judge from accepting a guilty plea from a defendant who still wants to proclaim his innocence. That is how the Alford plea, it was not the state making them do it. It was their attorneys. And I believe to this day, this was a face-saving measure. They knew they were not going to prevail at the new trial hearings in December. Either something had come out in the DNA testing that was inculpatory as to one or all of the three, and we don't know because they've never released those results. Or they simply realized that what they had was inconclusive and their witnesses were all liars and drug addicts and were not going to withstand cross-examination. On August 9th, 2011, there's another article in NWA Online which documents another meeting between Ellington and deputy prosecutors with McDaniel on August 9th. So Benka's got McDaniel kind of brokering this deal.
Mhm.
And the AG's office was responsible for all post-conviction work. The AG's office had attorneys working with the prosecutor's office, the Crittenden prosecutor's office or Craighead prosecutors, on the post-conviction claims and the post-conviction hearings and pleadings, etc.
Yeah.
So that was something that was going to come out of the AG's budget. Ellington, I think, was just lazy. He really had not done anything to learn anything about the case and was planning on using the new trial hearings as his discovery about the case.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yep.
So, you know, I mean, he didn't know. I wish Brent Davis had stayed on and not gotten elected for one more year.
Yeah, because
To
that's
get through those new trial hearings, because he would have said if they wanted a deal before the hearing, he would have said, let's talk after the hearing. And he would have said, if they get new trials, I would be amenable to an Alford plea.
Well, and so many of this stuff people think is just about, you know, oh, just perfect justice, which, you know,
Yeah.
you like to think it is, but so much of it is just political expediency.
And yeah, and it was. And for Ellington, it was political expediency. And not only does it end the new trial hearings and the risk of new trials being ordered, which after 18 years by that time would be very difficult to do. It's also ending any post-conviction claims. Like I said, I think Miskelley and Baldwin each had state post-conviction claims. They all three would have had federal post-conviction habeas claims up to and including the U.S. Supreme Court. And so this would have ended all of that. And so it would have ended it not only for the local prosecutor's office, but for the AG's office. And so that was how they decided to make everybody happy. And for people saying, well, the prosecutor, if he thought they were guilty, why would he let him go? Because it was the easiest, it was a path of least resistance for him.
Yeah.
He knows they're guilty. And in their Alford plea, they have to acknowledge that the state could convict him if they did go to trial. So it's in their best interest to enter this plea.
Exactly. Well, and again, sometimes it's just political expediency, right? You're just like, okay, these guys have $30 million that they're just going to continue to, berate me.
Right. And, while it is unusual, the only thing unusual is that they did these pleas before they got new trials. In most cases, an Alford plea doesn't come into play until a new trial's order. Michael Peterson in North Carolina, he didn't enter an Alford plea until he got a new trial. The woman in Florida, whose quote husband, Jessie Tafaro, I think her name, I remember her first name is Sunny, but I can't remember her last name. She was also on death row in Florida, and she got a new trial and entered an Alford plea. Marty Tankleff, he got a new trial and entered an Alford plea. I believe. I could be wrong. He may have gotten a new trial, and then the prosecutor decided not to re-prosecute him. So okay, take Tankleff off. But those are two cases where they were granted new trial in post-conviction, and then they entered an Alford plea. But again, they were believed to be guilty by the state, and they entered that Alford plea because the state believed him guilty.
Right.
But the state knew they couldn't be retried, or that a retrial would be too risky for the state, and just as risky for them. I mean, an Alford plea benefits both sides. In the case of Echols, Baldwin, and Miskelley, it got them out of prison right away. And there are other people who say, well, if they got new trials, it would have taken years. No, it would not have taken years.
No,
it would have taken 9 to 12 months. And if they didn't go to trial in 9 to 12 months, if the state wasn't ready to take them to trial, they could have those charges dismissed. And if you're actually innocent and you have the evidence to prove it, why don't you want that?
Yeah, exactly.
Even if you have to wait 2 years or 3 years.
Right,
but
because
again,
then you have the choice. Again, they all say, oh, that's it's the funny hypocrisy, because the fraudsters will say, oh, well, the state wanted the Alford plea because they didn't want to pay the money. But then you would say, conversely, well, if you're innocent, wouldn't you want to present your new evidence so you could sue the state and get all of that money?
Exactly. And that
doesn't make any sense.
And really, with the Alford pleas, the state really didn't have to have them sign those waivers, because with the Alford pleas, no claim against the state would have gone past
they're guilty.
The filing, because the state would have just taken the Alford plea, and it's like, it's guilty.
They pleaded guilty.
They're guilty. So, and they acknowledge that there was sufficient evidence to convict them in that plea. I think the other thing that was face-saving gesture was the statements made in the press after the Alford plea, in which Echols, Baldwin, and Miskelley said they intended to pursue exoneration from the outside, quote unquote.
Find the real killers, like OJ.
Yeah. Their advocates cited an informal agreement regarding future investigation and the potential for future forensic examination of evidence. And Ellington did state in interviews that he was willing to consider potential exculpatory evidence presented to him by the attorneys for Echols, Baldwin, and Miskelley. But none of these terms are included in the formal plea documents. So Ellington is not bound to do anything. Ellington is not bound to allow additional DNA testing. Ellington is not bound to send evidence to a lab in California for MVAC testing because Bob Ruff asked him to. The agreements are also silent as to the evidence in the case, its disposition, or its preservation. That is governed by state law, but again, it's not in the Alford pleas that the evidence is going to be kept by the West Memphis Police Department or the crime lab, or that the evidence is available whenever they want it to do whatever they want with it. So that is, I think that's pretty much, we talked about the informal, the 2 years wasted on informal requests for DNA testing that were never the way to accomplish DNA testing. And I think that was done entirely to plant stories in the media that say, we want to do this, we're entitled to do this, and the state won't let us, boo hoo hoo.
Right. Well, it's a little bit like, I don't think we didn't really talk about it this time, but the Holly weirdo who's been in the news the last, month, Johnny Depp, was a big West Memphis 3 supporter. He's a big Aleister Crowley guy, big, witchcraft guy. And so he naturally was, wanted to free these guys, but it's kind of the same thing with his trial. I don't think he necessarily wanted the money. He was just he had to file a lawsuit to try to win in the court of public opinion.
Yeah.
I think that's what a lot of these things are, is, Damien Echols hasn't, he's kind of been irrelevant for what the past, 5 or 6 years. No one's giving money to his GoFundMe. No one's, buying his, little magic trick book. And so he's just got to do something to keep, the celebrities have lost interest. He's got to do something to try to keep his name, front and center. So to raise some money. So he probably doesn't really care the actual outcome, as long as it generates a little bit of press coverage.
Right. And it generates, it's going to generate some money to Bob Ruff because he's got those stupid t-shirts.
I think I'm glad that I have not seen those.
Yeah. So, he's going to keep making money. He'll do another round of episodes when the DNA testing request is denied because it's A, filed in the wrong county. B, it's 3 years. Well, it's actually more than 3 years. It's 8 years too late, because they had 3 years after the Alford pleas, which was 2014. And it's using a method that was available at least by 2014. So there's no reason for them to wait 8 more years. And part of that is because his attorneys wasted 2 years instead of not getting anything from Ellington in 2020 and immediately filing a request for the DNA testing in court. Because that's what they needed to do all along. And, I can't say this enough. Bob Ruff never had any right to access to the evidence. He is not an investigator. He is not a state official. He was not even an attorney for the killers. He was in no way, shape, or form officially aligned with the killers or representing them or an agent of theirs. So he had no right for anything. And for him to imply that he did, again, is lying to the public.
But, I will say, though, I have to give him a little credit, because I think he's like Echols and Depp too. He probably knows that, but he also is savvy enough to realize there's a bunch of crazies out there who he can say he's going to do that, and then we'll run to his GoFundMe or Patreon and give him money because he's going to free them. And so, I mean, I will say, I will give him enough credit.
he is smart enough to realize most of his listeners are morons and will gladly give him money, even if he's completely lying about what he can do,
Yeah.
because they're never going to ask for the money back.
Yeah. So
that's always been his business model, is he's going to go free people from prison, and then, the crazy people will give him money to do that.
Yeah. And the thing that saddened me and really made me angry is the media, especially the Memphis media, has now begun really shilling for Echols, Baldwin, and Miskelley, or at least for Echols. Because they even they're conveying this false impression that the state has some obligation to send evidence off for testing to whatever lab Echols tells them to send it to, just on his word. And some of these, like Janice Broach, are supposedly, the law and crime reporters who purport to know what they're talking about, and yet so obviously don't. Because no state in the United States allows a person in prison or out of prison to say, you have to tell the prosecutor, you have to send this evidence to this lab in California to be tested. It's always going to go through the courts.
Right.
And it's always going to be governed by whatever state law is in place for DNA evidence. So, but the hearing is coming up on June 23rd. And I predict that it will probably be, the claim will probably be dismissed with prejudice, or without prejudice, so that he can refile it in Craighead County. And this is another example of how they're just playing to the court of public opinion, and they're not really trying to do this legally, because I think they know they're going to lose. Is they file this petition in the wrong county, and when the state responds and points out it's in the wrong county, they double down and say, no, it's not. It's not.
That's really weird, because that seems like such an easy thing to figure out.
It is.
That's why they're full of crud.
The state even tried to help them by filing Echols' plea agreement. And in big letters, it says Craighead County, not Crittenden, Craighead. So,
Strange.
I think that they have a judge in Crittenden who is going to grant the request. And I think they're probably wrong. So yeah, it's set for June 23rd, 2022 at 9:30 a.m. I am going to look online and see if there is a way, or will be a way, to watch this hearing or listen to it online. And if there is, I will post a link to it on Facebook. The state has also recently filed its notice of intent to use the transcript of the August 19th, 2011 hearing in State of Arkansas versus Damien Echols, case number 16, which stands for Craighead, JCR 93-450. So that's going to be interesting. But like I said, I think it's going to be dismissed either with prejudice or without prejudice, so that it can be refiled in Craighead. And then it'll be dismissed with prejudice, because it's 3 years. It's 8 years too late. And he hasn't made a showing of availability of MVAC testing.
All right.
So he's got to show that when he was doing testing in 2011, MVAC wasn't available. And he's actually got to show that MVAC wasn't available in 2014, which is the last date on which he could have asked for testing under the 3-year. So he's got to show that MVAC wasn't available until 2021 or 2022, which isn't true. Although MVAC, I got to say, I like the information on their site, but they really are very vague about when their casework has been done.
Right. Yeah.
But I do know from court opinions that MVAC was used in investigation of a 2011 murder in Utah.
2011.
And the murder occurred September 28, 2011. And MVAC was used. The company that developed MVAC is in Utah. So it was probably being used by law enforcement in Utah. But they talk about casework, and they received awards in 2013. And I think the FBI began its process of validating the technology. But I don't know when that began. I think they didn't finish it until 2020. But that doesn't change the fact that, because I think that's a multi-year process. But the burden's on Echols to prove when and how widespread it was available during those times when he could have asked for it earlier. He's got to prove why he didn't ask for it till 2020.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, all right. Well, I think that is, I think that pretty much covers it on the 29-year anniversary of the arrests, which occurred on June 3rd, 1993.
Well, it's an informative and as always, and appreciate all your research. And I would just encourage anybody who is listening and naturally is angry because they believe that, of course, they were innocent and the small town redneck cops, railroaded some poor Metallica fans. If you want to have that opinion, that's fair, but at least, read some of the documents, read the transcripts, do some research. Don't just listen to other people saying that. Really do some research before you come to that opinion.
Yeah, exactly. And if you still, after all that research, you still believe they're not guilty, then oh well. But at least don't.
At least you have an educated opinion that might be incorrect.
Yeah, and at least stop repeating the bullshit propaganda that's been around in the case since. I mean, I've been involved in it since right after Paradise Lost. So, I mean, I've been doing this for more than 20 years. And it's the same song and dance. I wash my hands of it and walk away. And then I see the same song and dance coming from other people. And I'm like, damn, why can't this go away?
Exactly.
And it never does.
No, they always.
Because just when you think they're going to quietly live out the rest of their lives and shut the fuck up, they start a new campaign of propaganda. It was the DNA testing, and it was a quote lost evidence that was never lost. And it was wanting DNA testing and lying and saying the state had an obligation to test it. And now it's going to be that the court was so unfair because they didn't grant DNA testing. And that's going to be the state's fault.
Right.
Even though it's not the state's fault, it's Echols' fault because his attorneys filed in the wrong place. They waited too long to do it. They waited too long to file and ask for it. And they didn't present enough evidence to show why they waited so long. Because this evidence has been around since 1993.
Yep.
And some of it was tested in 2005 through 2011. The ligatures have been tested. Bob Ruff has said, oh, well, nobody untied the ligatures to test the top, the inside, the knots. Well, they could have, and they should have in 2011. And I don't really trust Bob Ruff's assessment of what was done because he doesn't have the actual documents. He's just going based on what he thinks they did, probably.
Yeah, he's just
I take his name in vain. That's why I mention it so much.
No, I hear you. I just hate to give I hate to give him publicity because some moron's going to listen to this podcast and be like, oh, they're totally innocent. I'm going to listen to this goofus who thinks they're innocent, and then just give him more clicks.
Well, if they want to listen to a goofus that thinks they're innocent, that's on them.
Yeah, it's fair.
And
just
I haven't
remember
mentioned
that he got fired from a one engine firehouse because he was such a good investigator, he didn't even realize people were stealing directly from underneath his nose.
Oh God. Yeah, and I haven't mentioned the name of the podcast, which is the opposite of what it actually is.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Bob Ruff Bob Ruff likes truth like he likes a Golden Corral buffet.
Well, he looks like he likes Golden Corral buffets a lot.
Yeah.
Or is he too bougie for Golden Corral?
Yeah, it's probably right.
So, well, you know, people up in Michigan, it gets awfully cold, and I think their brains atrophy as time goes by because of the cold.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair.
And his wife made him build that little quote studio. So, you know, he has to go out there when it's cold.
Yes.
So yeah. That is all right. Well, I guess we're gonna wrap it up on Sunday night. Thank you for your patience, Kyle, with my power outages this afternoon, because that was very frustrating.
Well, I'm just glad you're safe, and yeah, thanks for all your research. Another great episode. Appreciate all of you bringing the actual real primary research to these conversations.
Thanks. And thank you everyone for listening to Based in Fact, a true crime podcast with Lisa O'Brien and co-host Kyle. If you like the show and want to know more, you can find us on Facebook or follow me on Twitter at O'BrienLN. Join us in 2 weeks for episode 12, State of Oklahoma versus Richard Eugene Glossop. Glossop was convicted of arranging the murder of his boss, Barry Van Treese, at the Best Budget Inn in Oklahoma City on January 7th, 1997. We will look at the case against Glossop, the legal proceedings, beginning with his 2007 direct appeal, and the claims put forth by a group of Oklahoma lawmakers who held a press conference in February to proclaim Glossop's innocence. Until then, have a great 2 weeks and stay safe. Good night.